Clara Whitmore did not cry. Not when she read the letter. Not when the envelope fell from her fingers onto the depot platform, and the Montana wind scattered it like something worthless. Not when the laughter started low and mean and rippling through the crowd like a sickness. She had crossed 1,900 miles for a man who could not even face her. And now the entire town of Silver Creek stood watching her the way people watch a stray dog in the rain. She picked up her trunk, both hands, alone. If this story already has your heart, stay with me until the very end. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like Clara's, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Silver Creek, Montana, 1884. The letter had been waiting for her. Not a man, not a welcome, not even the decency of a face-to-face rejection. Just an envelope sealed and left with the station master, handed to Clara Whitmore the moment her boots touched the Silver Creek platform, before she had even fully descended the train steps, before she had drawn her first real breath of Montana air, before she could take in anything around her, except the heat and the dust and the terrible stillness of a town that was already watching her. The station master was a thin man with a gray mustache and the particular expression of someone delivering news he found mildly entertaining. He held the envelope out the way you'd offer a piece of spoiled food at arm's length, with two fingers, the way you touched something you didn't want to touch too long. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes." "Letter for you." He paused. "From Mr. Brooks." She took it. The paper was thick and cream-colored and expensive. Nathaniel Brooks was the kind of man who bought thick, cream-colored, expensive paper. He had written her on it for 6 months. Careful letters, perfectly penned, full of phrases like, "A woman of your character, and the kind of partnership I've long been seeking, and I believe we could build something meaningful together in this territory." He had described his ranch in the kind of language that made you see it, even if you'd never been west of the Appalachians. He had written about Silver Creek like it was a place that deserved her, like he deserved her. She had read every letter twice, sometimes 3 times. Not because she was foolish or romantic or desperate, but because she was careful. Clara Whitmore had spent 24 years being careful. She had spent those years teaching other people's children in Boston, while managing her own survival on a schoolteacher's wages that were barely enough to cover rent and food, and the small dignities that made life feel like it still belonged to her. She had read those letters carefully because she needed to be sure. She had asked questions in her replies, specific, intelligent questions about finances and property, and what a partnership actually meant in practical terms. She had not agreed to come until she believed the answers added up. They had added up. She had been wrong about what they added up to. She opened the envelope standing on the platform, with her trunk at her feet, and one suitcase still in her left hand, and she read the words that were brief enough to be brutal. "The arrangement is no longer possible. Do not come to the ranch. I trust you'll manage your return arrangements accordingly." That was all. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement that she had sold nearly everything she owned to make this journey. No acknowledgement that she was standing on his platform, in his town, in his territory, with nowhere to go, and no one who knew her name. "I trust you'll manage your return arrangements accordingly." The letter fluttered in her fingers. She didn't let it fall. She folded it. She folded it carefully, the way she did everything, and she put it back inside the envelope, and she put the envelope inside her coat, and she stood very straight with her suitcase in her hand, and her trunk at her feet, and she did not cry. She was aware of the platform around her. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a room that's gone suddenly quiet with your skin, with the back of your neck. Passengers from the train were moving past her, collecting bags and greeting family members, and in the middle of that ordinary motion, she had become something still. Something they had to walk around. And they were looking. She could feel their looking before she could see it. The couple near the door of the depot, who had stopped their own conversation. The older woman with the shopping basket, who'd been mid-step and simply paused. The 2 men leaning against the far wall, who were not talking to each other, but were both watching her with the same slow, knowing expression, the expression of men who had seen this before, or imagined it, and found it satisfying to see it confirmed. A failed mail-order bride. She could feel the words forming in the air, even before anyone said them aloud. One of the women on the platform, younger, maybe 19 with a pink ribbon in her hair, leaned close to the woman beside her and whispered something behind her hand. Both of them glanced at Clara. The younger one's mouth curved in that particular smile that wasn't kind. A man near the depot door said it plainly enough to be heard, "Another one thinking a letter means a promise." Low laughter. Clara picked up her trunk. It was heavy, genuinely, physically heavy, packed with the materials of a life she'd dismantled to come here. Books she couldn't bear to sell. A wooden box of school supplies she'd brought, thinking she might be useful in whatever community she joined. 2 good dresses wrapped in brown paper. A wool blanket. A small photograph of her mother who was gone now, which was part of why she'd been willing to come so far in the first place. She picked it up with both hands and she started walking. She had no destination. She knew that. She was walking because standing still in front of people who were watching her. The way they were watching her was something she would not do. She would find somewhere to sit. She would think. She had $12.43 remaining after the train ticket, which was not enough for a return journey to Boston, but was enough for a few days if she was careful. She was always careful. She would figure it out. That trunk looks heavier than the man who abandoned you. The voice came from her right, low and rough and carrying just far enough to land, and the people nearby heard it, and some of them laughed, and Clara stopped. She turned slowly. Howe was standing near the wall of the depot building, half in shadow, like he'd been there a long time before any of this happened. Tall, broader than he looked from the front. He had a hat pushed back on his head, and his arms crossed over his chest, and the kind of weathered face that had spent most of its years outside, and not particularly cared what that looked like. Dark brown hair. Dark brown eyes that were not unkind exactly, but were not soft either. He looked like a man who had been worn down to his essential material by years of hard use, and what was left was something close to reliable. Howe was maybe 37-38. He wore working clothes, not the self-conscious working clothes of someone who'd put them on for appearance, but actual working clothes. Dusty and a little faded, like he'd come into town because he needed something, and was not especially interested in the social performance of being in town. Howe was looking at her. Not the way the others were looking at her. Not with entertainment or embarrassment or pity. He was looking at her the way you'd look at a problem you were considering whether to involve yourself in. "That was unkind," Clara said. "Yeah," he agreed. He didn't look particularly repentant. "Then why say it?" He uncrossed his arms and pushed off the wall. "Because everyone else was saying it with their eyes, and at least I said it out loud." She didn't have an answer for that immediately. She wasn't sure it deserved one. "I have a wagon outside," he said. He walked toward her. "I can take that trunk." "I don't know you." "No," he said. He picked up her trunk, like it weighed about 1/3 of what it actually weighed, which she found both useful and irritating. "Elias Carter. I've got a ranch about 4 miles out." That's not an introduction. That's a description. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Fair enough. Elias Carter. I'm not dangerous. I'm not trying to get anything from you, and you need somewhere to put your things while you figure out your next move." That's the full introduction. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had been careful her whole life, and it had still brought her here to this platform, with a man she didn't know, offering to carry her belongings. She made the calculation that she made about most things quickly and without sentiment. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Broken River Ranch," he said. "I've got a barn and a spare room, and I'm not in the habit of leaving people standing on platforms." "That's not a habit many people share," she said, and she heard a small bitterness in her own voice that she hadn't intended to let out. "No," he said. "It isn't." He carried her trunk toward the wagon without waiting for her formal agreement, which was presumptuous, but she followed with her suitcase because the alternatives were limited, and she was too tired and too angry to manufacture pride out of nothing. The wagon was around the side of the depot, building a working wagon. No ornamentation pulled by a bay horse that looked solid, and not particularly interested in drama, which Clara immediately appreciated. Elias loaded her trunk into the back and then stood at the side of the wagon and didn't offer to help her up. which she also appreciated because she didn't need help climbing into a wagon, and she would have been annoyed if he'd assumed otherwise. She climbed up and settled herself on the bench and arranged her suitcase at her feet. He went around to the other side and got up and picked up the reins. "You're Clara Whitmore," he said. It wasn't a question. "You knew who I was." Silver Creek isn't large. Brooks told people he was expecting a woman from Boston. He paused. He didn't tell people he was sending her back. "No," Clara said. "He wouldn't have." The wagon moved out from the side of the depot into the dusty main road of Silver Creek, and she looked at the town as they moved through it. It was a real town bigger than she'd expected. A general store, a bank building, 2 saloons. She could see a church at the far end of the main street, a school building that she noticed automatically and felt a small reflexive pull toward before she stopped herself. There were people on the boardwalks going about their business in the afternoon heat, and several of them looked at the wagon as it passed, and some of them looked at her. "How long have you been in this territory?" she asked. 14 years, since I was 23. "You came here from where?" "Missouri." He kept his eyes on the road. "My father had land here. I came to help him. He died about 4 years ago and left me the ranch and a pile of problems I've been sorting through since." "What kind of problems?" He glanced at her sideways. It was the first time he'd fully looked at her since they'd left the depot, and it was a different kind of look. Assessing, slightly surprised, like the question was not what he'd expected. "Financial," he said. "The kind that come from trusting the wrong people too long." She thought about that. "Did you know Nathaniel Brooks before he sent for me?" The road out of town was quieter now, just dust and dry grass and the sound of the horses' hooves. The Montana sky overhead was enormous in the way she'd read about, but hadn't quite been able to imagine blue so deep and wide. It felt like it was pressing down on you with friendly weight. "I know him," Elias said. "Everyone in this county knows Brooks. He's the largest landowner in the territory or close to it. What he doesn't own, he's working on acquiring." "He wanted your land." Another sideways look, longer this time. "What makes you say that?" "Because you said he wanted land he doesn't own," Clara said. "And you said you have financial problems left by your father. And Nathaniel Brooks invited a woman from Boston to be his wife, and when she arrived, he sent her a letter rather than face her." She looked at the road ahead. Men who behave that way are usually managing something they don't want examined. The silence lasted long enough that she thought she might have misjudged. Perhaps she'd said too much. Perhaps she'd made the same mistake she'd made with students, sometimes moved too quickly through the reasoning and left the other person behind, which was never useful. "You're a school teacher," he said. "I was." "They teach you to think like that in Boston." "They taught me to read," she said. "Everything else I taught myself." I didn't say anything after that for a while, and she let the silence sit. The land opened up around them as they got farther from town, big and golden and dry in the summer heat, with mountain ridges far to the west that were still snow-capped even in August. She watched it and thought that it was beautiful in the way that very difficult things are sometimes beautiful honestly, without pretending to be anything softer than it was. Broken River Ranch came into view as they crested a small rise, and it was immediately clear to Clara that the name was not the only thing that was broken about it. The main house was a solid enough structure, timber 2 stories built to last, but it needed paint, and at least 2 of the outbuildings had a lean to them that suggested deferred maintenance. The fencing was in varying states of repair. The yard had the particular look of a place where one person had been doing the work of 3. "It was better when my father was alive," Elias said without inflection. "He had more hands working the place. After he died, I found out some of where the money had been going. Some of the hands left when the wages got thin." "When did the wages get thin?" "About 2 years before he died, from what I can tell. The books don't make much sense." He brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house and sat there with the reins in his hands. "I'm not a man who's comfortable with numbers. I'm a rancher. I know land and cattle and horses. The business side of things, I've been managing it badly." He didn't seem embarrassed by this admission. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, like a fact about the weather. Clara climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard and looked at the house and the outbuildings and the fencing and the dry summer grass. She did not see what was broken. She saw what the shape of the place had been before it started breaking. She could see the logic of it, where the buildings were positioned, how the land was laid out, what the person who had designed this ranch had understood about the work of running it. "Can I see the books?" she said. I was lifting her trunk out of the wagon, and he stopped and looked at her. "The financial records," she said. "The ledgers your father kept. The contracts if you have them. Whatever paperwork there is related to the ranch accounts." "Why?" "Because you said you can't make sense of them," she said. "I spent 6 years managing the finances of the school where I taught because the school board was incompetent and no one else would do it. I can read a ledger." He put the trunk down on the ground and stood with his hands on his hips and looked at her for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite skepticism. It was the expression of a man recalibrating. "I don't need charity," he said. "I'm not offering charity," Clara said. "I need somewhere to stay while I determine what I'm going to do next. You have a spare room. It seems like a fair exchange." He picked up the trunk again and carried it toward the house. "Kitchen's in the back," he said over his shoulder. "There's water on the stove. I'll get the books after supper." It was not a warm invitation, but it was a real one. She followed him inside. The house was clean, which surprised her somewhat. Not neat in a domestic way, but clean the way a man who respects space keeps a space without decoration, but without disorder. There was a large stone fireplace in the main room, cold now in the summer heat, and a table with 2 chairs and a third chair pushed against the wall. The kitchen was in the back, as he'd said, with a wood stove and shelves of practical supplies. There was a door leading to a back room, what she assumed was the spare room he'd mentioned, and a staircase leading up to what she assumed was where he slept. He put her trunk in the back room without ceremony and left her to it. She looked around the small room. A bed, a chest of drawers, a window looking out onto the back of the property. Simple and spare, and hers at least for now. She sat down on the edge of the bed and took the letter out of her coat pocket. She read it again. She didn't know why. The words were the same. "The arrangement is no longer possible. Do not come to the ranch. I trust you'll manage your return arrangements accordingly." She folded it again. She thought about Nathaniel Brooks, who had written her careful letters on thick cream paper for 6 months, and then sent a station master to hand her this. She thought about what Elias Carter had said, that Brooks was the largest landowner in the territory, and that the land he didn't own, he was working on acquiring. She thought about the ledgers that didn't add up, and the hands who'd left when the wages went thin, and the father who had died leaving behind a mess his son couldn't untangle. She thought about the way Brooks had answered her questions in those letters. Carefully. Too carefully, she could see now, in the particular way that someone answers who knows what they want you to believe and is constructing it for you. She had been careful, but she hadn't been careful enough. She put the letter in the chest of drawers and stood up and went to wash the travel from her face. After supper, which Elias made without asking for help and without conversation. A plain meal of beans and salt pork and cornbread. That was exactly what she needed. He put 3 ledgers on the table and a box of loose papers beside them. "That's what I have," he said, "going back about 10 years. Clara pulled the nearest ledger toward her and opened it. He sat across the table and watched her. She spent the first 20 minutes in silence, turning pages carefully, not commenting, just reading. He poured himself a cup of coffee and didn't offer her one, and then seemed to think better of it and put a second cup on the table beside her, which she drank without acknowledging either the gesture or the coffee specifically. "These entries here," she said finally. She turned the ledger to face him and pointed. "Do you recognize this handwriting?" He leaned forward to look. "That's not my father's hand." "No," Clara said. "That's what I thought. This entire column has been entered by someone else. Look at the ink, it's a slightly different shade. Whoever added these entries used a different pen and probably did it at a different time than the surrounding entries." He looked at her. "These are payments to a company called Meridian Land Holdings," she said. "Do you know what that is?" "No. It appears 9 times in these books over a 3-year period." She pulled the second ledger over and found the page she wanted. 12 times here over the following 2 years. The amounts are large enough that if you total them, She did the arithmetic quickly on the edge of a loose sheet of paper. The ranch should have no resources left, and yet the ranch was still operating. Because the bank extended credit, he said slowly. Yes. She nodded. And if Meridian Land Holdings was receiving payments, the ranch couldn't actually afford someone, was engineering debt. Real debt owed to a real bank, tied to a ranch that's been systematically drained. When the bank calls the loan, the ranch goes to auction, he said. He said it quietly. The way you say something when you've suspected it for a long time and you've just been handed the shape of your suspicion in plain language. Do you know anyone connected to a company by that name? Clara asked. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very level. Brooks has a business associate who handles some of his land acquisitions. Man named Mercer. I don't know what companies he operates under. Clara turned back to the ledger. Tell me everything you know about how Nathaniel Brooks conducts his business. He told her. It took until nearly midnight. When they finished, the table was covered with papers, and both coffee cups were empty, and the room had gone cool with the night air coming in through the kitchen window. Clara sat back and looked at the pattern she'd assembled from everything in front of her. The altered entries, the false company, the manufactured debt, and the 6 months of carefully constructed letters to a woman in Boston he had never intended to marry. She'd been a distraction. She could see that clearly now. He had invited her here not because he wanted a wife, but because he wanted to occupy attention his own or someone else's. She wasn't yet certain which. He had backed out the moment she'd written asking specific questions about property boundaries and financial arrangements, questions that a woman he could manage comfortably would not have thought to ask. He had seen her intelligence, and he had cut her loose. He made a mistake, she said. Elias looked at her. He made about $100,000 worth of mistakes from what you're showing me. No, Clara said. He made one mistake. He sent me to this depot instead of a different one. She looked across the table at him. If he'd shipped me back to Boston, I'd have gone home and started over and never known any of this. Instead, he put me in the same town as you. Elias looked at the papers between them and then back at her. His expression was the same level, measured expression she was coming to recognize as his default. The face of a man who did not react quickly to things and was not going to start now. What are you planning? He asked. Evidence, she said. Real evidence, not ledgers that can be called forgeries or disputed. Court-quality evidence. Documents, witnesses, records. She looked at the stack of papers. There's a surveyor who altered boundary maps if the records I found are what I think they are. There are bank officials who processed fraudulent transfers. There are letters, and Brooks is a man who writes letters, which means there are letters. Men like that leave trails because they believe they're untouchable. He's been untouchable in this county for 15 years, Elias said. He's never had someone looking who knew what to look for, Clara said. The fire was low, and the room was quiet, and outside something moved in the yard, a horse shifting, or the wind against the fence. Elias picked up the ledger and looked at the page she'd shown him. He looked at it for a long time. You came out here to get married, he said finally. To start a different kind of life. I came out here to build something, Clara said. The man I came for turned out to be a fraud. That doesn't change what I came for. He set the ledger down. I'm not in the habit of taking charity either, he said quietly. What you're offering to do going through these records, building a case, that's not a small thing. That's months of work. I'm aware of that. So I'm asking again, what do you want out of this? Clara looked at him steadily. I want to stay in Silver Creek. I have $12.43 and nowhere else to go, and a month until the weather turns. I want to work for my room and board, and what I have to offer is exactly what you need. She paused. And I want to see Nathaniel Brooks explain those ledgers in a courtroom. If I'm being honest, I want that considerably. Something moved in his face, then not quite a smile, but something that was in the family of one. All right, he said. He gathered up the loose papers and stacked them neatly and pushed back from the table. Get some sleep. I'll have coffee on at first light, and we can figure out where to start. He took his coffee cup to the kitchen, and she heard him move through the house and up the stairs, and then it was quiet. Clara sat at the table alone with the ledgers and the papers and the lamp burning low between them. She reached into her pocket from habit before she remembered she'd put it in the chest of drawers for the letter. Then she left it there. She looked at the ledgers. She thought about the thick cream paper and the careful sentences and the 6 months of letters and the town where people laughed when a woman arrived alone with her trunk and no one waiting. She thought about a company called Meridian Land Holdings and a surveyor who had changed boundary maps and a bank that had extended credit that was slowly becoming a rope. She thought about Elias Carter, who had picked up her trunk without being asked and driven her 4 miles out of town and put coffee on the table beside her without comment. She wasn't here because someone had saved her. She was here because she hadn't let them decide she was finished. She turned to the first page of the oldest ledger. She picked up her pen. And she started at the beginning. She was still at the table when the first light came through the kitchen window. Not because she had worked through the night in some dramatic display of dedication, but because the numbers had stopped adding up in a way she couldn't walk away from. And once Clara Whitmore found a thread that didn't belong in the weave, she pulled it until she understood where it had come from. Elias found her there at 5 in the morning, with 3 ledgers open side by side, and a page of her own handwriting covered in columns and notations. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment without saying anything. Then he went to the stove and started the coffee. "You sleep at all?" he asked. "Some," she said, which was not quite true. She had gone to the back room around 2 and lain down on top of the quilt, and closed her eyes and thought about numbers until something clarified, and then she had gotten up and come back to the table. He put a cup of coffee beside her without comment. She didn't acknowledge it specifically, just wrapped her hand around it and kept her eyes on the page in front of her. "I found something," she said. He sat down across from her. He looked like a man who had slept not well, but some, and he had the settled morning quality of someone who'd already been outside, already checked whatever needed checking before the sun was fully up. There was a little dust on his boots that hadn't been there the night before. "Tell me," he said. She turned her page toward him. Meridian Land Holdings received 37 separate payments from this ranch over 5 years. The payments were entered into the books in handwriting that isn't your father's. The ink is different. The pen pressure is different. She pointed. But here's what matters. The payments correspond exactly to dates when your father was away from the ranch. Elias looked at the page. He looked at it for a long time. He traveled for cattle business twice a year, he said slowly. Spring and fall. Every single Meridian payment falls within those windows, Clara said. Someone was coming to this ranch when your father was gone and altering the books in person. The silence in the kitchen was very complete. Who had access to the house? She asked. He thought about it. My father's foreman, man named Greer. He left the ranch about 6 months after my father died, just picked up and moved on, which I thought was strange at the time. He paused. Brooks has a man named Greer working his south pasture now. I've seen him on the road. Clara wrote the name down. I need you to tell me every person your father did regular business with, she said. And I need you to think about whether there's anyone who might have kept letters or records, a lawyer, a land agent, anyone your father trusted with paperwork. There was a lawyer in town, Elias said. Old man named Whitfield. He drew up the original deed to this land when my father first acquired it. He died 2 years ago. He paused. But his daughter inherited his office. She runs a dressmaking shop on the main street now, but I think she kept his files. Does she know you? She knows of me. Would she speak to me? He considered. Margaret Whitfield is a fair woman. If you go to her straight and tell her what you're looking for and why, she'll either help you or tell you plainly she won't. He paused. She won't tell Brooks you came, that I'd stake something on. Clara closed the ledger and sat back. She picked up the coffee with both hands and looked at him across the table. I want to go into town today. He looked at her steadily. People are going to talk. People are already talking, Clara said. I'd rather give them something worth talking about. For the second time, something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in the family of one. He finished his coffee and stood up. I'll hitch the wagon. The drive into Silver Creek was quieter than the one the day before, but differently quiet. Not the silence of two people who don't know each other, but the silence of two people who have been awake half the night working on the same problem and don't need to fill the air with words to know they're moving in the same direction. She noticed things about the land she hadn't noticed the day before. The way the road curved along what had probably once been a creek bed. The fence lines where they were well maintained and where they weren't, and whose land they bordered. There were places where the fencing style changed, where newer posts had replaced older ones in a way that suggested a boundary had moved. These fence lines, she said. Along this section here, when were these posts put in? Elias looked at where she was indicating. About 3 years ago. The previous line was about 40 feet further north. Brooks's man told my father the survey had been corrected, that there'd been an error in the original mapping. Clara said nothing. She looked at the fence line for a long time as they passed it. How much land did you lose when the boundary moved? She asked. About 12 acres of good grazing land, he said. Not enough to fight over. That's what everyone said. That's what someone wanted everyone to say, Clara said. He looked at her. 12 acres here, she said. What else? Where else have boundaries shifted since your father's health declined? He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him going back through years of things he'd accepted at face value because he'd been fighting too many other fires to examine everyone. There's a water access point on the eastern edge of the property, he said, and his voice had changed slightly, the particular flatness of someone who is only now understanding the shape of something. My father had an easement for it going back to the original deed. About 4 years ago, the access point was blocked. Fence went up overnight. Brooks's people said the easement had lapsed, showed my father a document. My father was sick by then, and he didn't fight it. I need to see that document, Clara said. I don't know that I have it. Then Whitfield's files might. Silver Creek was busier in the morning than it had been when she'd arrived the day before, and as Elias brought the wagon down the main street, she was aware again of being watched. A woman who'd been walking into the general store paused on the boardwalk. 2 men outside the barber shop looked up. She kept her eyes ahead and her back straight and her face entirely composed because she was not going to give Silver Creek the performance it seemed to be waiting for. Elias pulled the wagon up outside the dressmaker's shop and got down and tied the horse. He went around to her side without offering to help her down. He'd learned that from the day before and simply waited beside the wagon while she descended. You want me to come in? He asked. Can you be quiet? He looked at her for a moment. When I need to be. Then come in. The shop was small and well organized, which Clara noticed approvingly, and it smelled like fabric and cedar and something faintly floral that was probably the dried lavender hanging near the window. A woman looked up from behind the counter. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back practical, and a face that held the particular quality of someone who had paid attention to people her whole life and had strong, settled opinions as a result. Margaret Whitfield looked at Clara. She looked at Elias. She looked at Clara again. Mr. Carter, she said with a slight emphasis that was not unfriendly, but was not uninformed either. Miss Whitfield, he said. This is Clara Whitmore. She arrived on yesterday's train. I heard, Margaret Whitfield said, and her tone made it completely clear that she had heard exactly what everyone in Silver Creek had heard, and that she was reserving judgment on what it meant. I need to look at your father's files, Clara said without preamble. Specifically, anything related to Broken River Ranch deeds, easements, surveys, correspondence. Margaret Whitfield looked at her for a long, assessing moment. Clara met her eyes and didn't explain or apologize or soften the request. Why? Margaret Whitfield asked. Because I believe your father's documents will show that someone has been systematically altering property records in this county for the better part of a decade, Clara said. And I believe the documents held in official offices have already been changed. Your father's personal files may still reflect the original record. The shop was very quiet. Margaret Whitfield set down the fabric she'd been holding. My father was a careful man, she said. I'm counting on that, Clara said. Another long moment. Then Margaret Whitfield said, The files are in the back room. I'll make tea. She led them through a door at the back of the shop, into a small room that was essentially a library of legal documents organized, labeled, maintained with the precise care of a man who had taken his responsibilities seriously. Clara felt something tighten in her chest at the sight of it. She had loved her own father for similar reasons, the kind of man who believed that order was a form of integrity. She found the Broken River Ranch files in under 10 minutes. She went through them methodically. Margaret Whitfield sat in the corner with 2 cups of tea and watched, and Elias stood near the door with his hat in his hands and said nothing, which was the most useful thing he could have done. The original deed was there. The original survey was there. And the original easement document was there granting Broken River Ranch perpetual access to the eastern water point, signed and witnessed and dated 1871 with Josiah Carter's name on it and the previous county land agent's seal. Clara put it on the table. She put the original survey down beside it. She compared the property boundaries on the old survey with what she knew of the current fence lines, and what she saw made her sit very still for a moment. "Miss Whitfield," she said quietly, "is there a surveyor in this county named Aldous Pratt?" Margaret Whitfield's expression shifted in a way that was informative. There was. He retired about 4 years ago, moved out to a small property south of town. He drinks considerably. Did your father know him? My father had very little respect for him, Margaret Whitfield said carefully. He told me once that Pratt was the kind of man whose professional opinion could be adjusted with sufficient motivation. Clara looked at Elias. He was looking at the documents on the table with the expression of a man who is rearranging a view he has held for years and finding that the new arrangement explains things the old one couldn't. "We need to speak with Pratt," she said. He put his hat back on. "He won't want to talk." "No," Clara agreed. "He won't." She thanked Margaret Whitfield with genuine warmth. The older woman pressed her hand briefly and said in a quiet voice, "My father would have wanted those records used for exactly this purpose." And they left with copies of the original documents tucked inside Clara's coat. On the boardwalk outside, Elias said, "Pratt lives about 2 miles south. You sure you want to do this today?" "I'm sure I want to do it before Brooks finds out I've been looking at records," Clara said. "Because when he finds out, and he will find out, this town is not large, he'll start managing what can be found." They drove south. Aldous Pratt was exactly what Clara had been prepared for, a man who had once been professional and was now something else, living in a small property that had the same particular disorder of deferred everything. A man who answered the door in the middle of the morning with the careful movements of someone navigating a body that had been treated roughly. He looked at Elias. He looked at Clara. Then he tried to close the door. Elias put his hand on it. Not roughly, just firmly. "Mr. Pratt," Clara said from around Elias's arm. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I have copies of the original survey of Broken River Ranch, and I have the altered survey that was filed 4 years ago. I can see what changed. I'm not here because I need you to tell me what happened. I already know what happened. I'm here because when this goes to court, and it will go to court, you will have a choice about whether you're the man who was paid to lie or the man who told the truth when it mattered." Aldous Pratt's face went through several things in quick succession. "Nobody's going to court," he said. "Brooks." "Brooks is not the law," Elias said. "He's been acting like he is. That's different." Pratt looked between them. His hands were not entirely steady. "He'll know. If I talk, he'll know." "He'll know regardless," Clara said. "The question is whether you're on the right side of it when he does." Silence. Long enough that Clara counted it in her head. Then Pratt said, "You want to come in," and stepped back from the door. They were in his kitchen for 40 minutes. He confirmed everything not easily, not without several points, at which he stopped and said he couldn't. And both times Clara simply waited with the patience of a woman who had managed a room full of frightened children and knew that fear needed to exhaust itself before it could be replaced with something more useful. He had altered the survey. Brooks' man Mercer had approached him directly. He had been paid in a substantial amount, with the implicit understanding that there would be trouble if he refused, and that the recording official at the county office, a man named Dawes, was already managed. The boundary change had been filed as a correction to an original survey error. No one had questioned it because no one had checked the original. No one had checked the original because no one had thought to. "Would you put this in writing?" Clara asked. He looked at her like she'd asked him to put his hand in fire. "I'll think about it," he said. She left him with the understanding that she'd be back in 2 days, and that he should think very carefully about what his options actually were. On the road back toward town, she sat with the documents in her lap and went through everything she now held. Elias was quiet for the long time. Then he said, "You've done more in 1 day than I did in 4 years." "You were fighting it alone," Clara said. "And you didn't know what you were fighting." "And you do. I know what kind of man does this," she said. "I had a school board chairman in Boston who ran the same general operation on a smaller scale. He manufactured debt against the school's building fund and used it to argue the school should be consolidated with a school on the other side of town, which would have meant selling the building, which he happened to have a buyer for." She paused. "The mechanism is always the same. Create debt that appears legitimate. Manufacture reasons why the property can't sustain itself. Make sure the person holding the property doesn't have the resources or the knowledge to fight, and then acquire." "What happened with your school board chairman?" "He's currently explaining himself to a rather thorough committee of inquiry," Clara said. "Which is part of why the school no longer needed me, since the chaos that followed his exposure made budgets complicated." A small dry pause. "Every good action has its inconveniences." He laughed at that. It was sudden and brief and completely genuine, and it changed his face entirely for the moment. It lasted, gave her a glimpse of something underneath the weathered steadiness, something younger and less defended. Then it was gone, and he was the same level-measured person again. But she had seen it. "There's one more person I need to talk to," she said. "The bank." He sobered immediately. "The bank manager is a man named Harlan Cole. He's been in this county since before Brooks arrived. He's not a bad man exactly. But he's the kind of man who accommodates the most powerful person in the room and has convinced himself that this is wisdom rather than cowardice." "I know that kind of man very well," Clara said. "I'm not going to ask him to be brave. I'm going to show him that being on the wrong side of this is going to be considerably more inconvenient than the right side. He won't see you alone. He'll see me with you." Elias glanced at her. "You want to walk into the Silver Creek Bank with me today and ask Harlan Cole about his relationship with Nathaniel Brooks?" "Yes." "Cole will tell Brooks by sundown." "Good," Clara said. "I want Brooks to know I'm looking. I want him to make a move. A man like that, when he feels threatened, does something. And when he does something, he shows what he's protecting." Elias was quiet for a moment. "You're using yourself as bait." "I'm using the situation as information," Clara corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" She looked at him. "The difference is that I know I'm doing it." The bank was the most substantial building on Silver Creek's Main Street brick, with a proper facade, the kind of building designed to communicate stability and permanence. It communicated those things slightly less convincingly up close, where you could see the repair work on the front window frame and the way the sign had faded. Harlan Cole was a compact man in his 50s, with the face of someone who had spent decades performing calm and had eventually merged with the performance. He looked at Elias Carter the way you look at a problem you've been managing from a careful distance. He looked at Clara with genuine puzzlement. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I wasn't expecting—" "Miss Whitmore would like to discuss the Broken River Ranch loan account," Elias said. "She has some questions about the payment history." Cole looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore isn't a party to—" "She's helping me with the accounts," Elias said. "I've authorized her to act in that capacity." Cole shifted. He was calculating she could see it, trying to decide what this meant and what Brooks would want him to do and what the safe position was. "I don't see that there's much to discuss," he said. "The account is in arrears and the loan terms specify." "Mr. Cole," Clara said, and something in her voice made him stop. She put the copies of the original documents on his desk. The original survey, the original easement, the deed with the original property description. "I'd like you to look at these and tell me whether they match the records you hold in this bank." He looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time without touching them. When he looked up, his face had changed in a very specific way. The way a man's face changes when he realizes that the careful position he's been maintaining has suddenly become considerably less comfortable. "Where did you get these?" he said quietly. "Your predecessor's files," Clara said. Held privately, not accessible to anyone who might have wanted to adjust them. The office was very quiet. The foreclosure proceedings, Clara said. When were they filed? Cole said nothing. Mr. Cole, Elias said from beside her. His voice was quiet, but it carried something in it that was not a threat exactly, but was the statement of a man who had been patient for a very long time and was no longer going to perform patience. The question isn't complicated. Cole sat back in his chair. He looked like a man doing arithmetic, the particular arithmetic of someone weighing one set of consequences against another and realizing the scales had shifted. The foreclosure notice was filed 6 weeks ago, he said. Drafted by Mercer Brooks's associate. I was told the loan documentation supported it. And you checked? A pause. I reviewed what Mercer provided. Not the original loan records. Another pause. Longer. The original ledger was pulled for review. It was returned with an annotation indicating the terms had been modified. Who added the annotation? He didn't answer. Mr. Cole, Clara said, and her voice was not unkind. She genuinely did not need it to be unkind. You're not a dishonest man. I don't believe that. I think you are a man who accepted documents at face value because questioning them would have put you in a very uncomfortable position with a very powerful person. I understand the mathematics of that decision. But I need you to understand that the mathematics have changed. He looked at her. When this is brought before a territorial court, she said. When not if, said with complete quiet certainty. The question they will ask is whether the bank's officer had reason to question the documentation. I'm handing you that reason right now in the form of original records that don't match your current files. What you do with that information in the next few days will define what answer you're able to give. Cole sat very still. Then he said, I want to speak with a lawyer. That seems wise, Clara said. I'd recommend doing it before you speak with Brooks or anyone associated with him. She gathered her documents. She stood. She looked at Harlan Cole once more, and he looked back at her with the expression of a man who has just understood that the story he thought he was in is not the story that is actually happening. On the boardwalk outside, the afternoon sun was pressing down hard, and the street was busy with the ordinary activity of a working town. Elias walked beside her back toward the wagon, and neither of them said anything until they were almost at it. Then he said, He'll tell Brooks. Within the hour, Clara agreed. And Brooks will do something, she said. Yes. She got up into the wagon herself. That's the point. He stood beside the wagon for a moment, looking at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the look of a man recalibrating again, adjusting his understanding of something. Miss Whitmore, he said. Clara. He paused. Clara, do you understand that when Brooks responds it may not be through legal channels? She looked at him. I grew up poor in Boston, she said. I taught school for 6 years on wages that didn't cover my rent. I dealt with a school board chairman who threatened to end my employment when I started asking questions about the finances. I am not a woman who frightens easily. She paused. But I'm not naive either. I know what a man like Brooks does when he's cornered. Then you know we need to move fast. We need to move right, she said. Fast and right in that order. He got up onto the wagon bench. There's one more thing, she said. The foreman, Greer, the one who left your ranch after your father died and now works for Brooks. What about him? He knows where the bodies are buried, she said. Figuratively. He altered those books in your house while your father was away. He knows what he was paid, who paid him, and what the arrangement was. If we can get to him before Brooks realizes he's a liability... She stopped, because Elias had stopped, and the look on his face had changed completely. What? She said. I was looking past her toward the far end of the main street. She turned. A man was standing outside the saloon at the end of the block, watching the wagon. He was broad-shouldered, well-dressed, with the particular stillness of a man who was accustomed to commanding spaces simply by occupying them. He had a companion beside him, but he was not looking at the companion. He was looking at the wagon. At her. She knew without any introduction required that she was looking at Nathaniel Brooks, and he was looking at her with an expression she recognized, not anger, not surprise. Assessment. He was looking at her the way you look at something you've underestimated and are now recalculating. He's already heard, Elias said quietly. Yes, Clara said. She did not look away. Neither did Brooks for a long moment. Then he said something to his companion and turned and went back into the saloon, and the door swung shut behind him. He's going to come after the ranch, Elias said. Directly. Whatever he'd planned before, he's going to accelerate it. Then we accelerate too, Clara said. She turned back to face the road ahead, and her hands were steady in her lap, and her mind was already on what came next. She had gone to sleep the night before as a woman without a plan and a letter of rejection in her chest drawer. She was going to that same room tonight as someone Nathaniel Brooks had just decided needed to be dealt with. She was not afraid. She was, if she was honest with herself, something close to ready. Brooks moved fast. Faster than Clara had expected, which meant he was more threatened than she'd calculated, which meant the evidence was better than she'd hoped. She found out about the first move the next morning when Elias came in from the barn with his jaw set and a piece of paper in his hand and put it on the table in front of her without a word. It was a notice from the Silver Creek Bank. Formal language official letterhead. Harlan Cole's signature at the bottom. The notice stated that the foreclosure proceedings on Broken River Ranch had been accelerated due to the borrower's failure to maintain adequate communication with the lending institution, and that a hearing date had been set for 3 weeks, hence before the county land commissioner. 3 weeks. Clara looked at the paper. She looked at the date. She looked at the signature. Cole moved on this yesterday, she said, before we'd even gotten back to the ranch. Brooks was in his office before we cleared the main street, Elias said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with the particular heaviness of a man absorbing something he'd half expected but hoped wouldn't come. I heard it from Jim Tabor this morning. He runs the feed store. He sees everything that goes through that street. Said Brooks went straight from the saloon to the bank. Spent 40 minutes in Cole's office. And Cole filed the acceleration this morning. Posted by Ryder. That notice reached me before breakfast. Clara set the paper down and looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and pulled her working page toward her. 3 weeks, she said. That's enough time. For what? For everything we need, she said. If we move today. He looked at her. He had the expression he got when she said things that covered ground faster than he could track, and he was deciding whether to ask her to slow down or trust the direction. She had noticed he always chose to trust the direction. She appreciated that about him more than she'd said. Pratt first, she said. I told him 2 days. I'm moving that up. I want his written statement today before Brooks realizes he's a loose end and decides to manage him. Pratt's not going to. Pratt is going to, Clara said with a certainty that came not from arrogance, but from having read the man's face in his kitchen yesterday, and having spent 6 years reading the faces of people deciding whether they were brave enough to do the right thing. He's been living with this for 4 years. The guilt of it has done half my work already. Elias said nothing. He stood up and went to get his hat. Aldous Pratt answered the door faster this time, which meant he'd been expecting them, which meant he'd been thinking about nothing else since they'd left. His face had the look of a man who had reached a decision in the night and wasn't entirely at peace with it, but had made it nonetheless. He let them in without being asked. I'll write the statement, he said before Clara could speak. She looked at him. What changed? He sat down at his kitchen table and put his hands flat on the surface and looked at them. My daughter lives in Billings, he said. She has children, 3 of them. He paused. I've been thinking about what kind of man her children's grandfather is. What kind of man they'll know when they're old enough to know it. Another pause. I was paid well. I've spent every cent of it, and it didn't make me feel like anything except what I am. Clara sat down across from him. She kept her voice very even. I appreciate this, Mr. Pratt. I want you to know that your statement will be given to a court of law, and what you say today will be on record. Brooks will know. I know he'll know. And you're prepared for that. He looked up at her then, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who was scared and had decided to be scared moving forward rather than scared standing still. No, he said honestly. But I'm doing it anyway. She had him write it in his own hand, which was what courts preferred and what was hardest to challenge. She sat beside him while he wrote it, and she did not rush him, and she did not prompt him. Elias stood near the door and said nothing, but his presence in the room had a quality she was coming to rely on, solid and uncomplicated, a kind of ballast. The statement took 40 minutes to write and covered 3 pages. It named Brooks directly. It named Mercer. It named Dawes, the county recording official. It described the payment, the instruction, the falsified survey correction, filed as an administrative amendment to avoid the scrutiny a formal resurvey would have attracted. When Pratt signed it, his hand shook slightly. He pressed the pen down anyway. Clara folded the statement with the care she gave to everything that mattered and put it inside her coat. "Is there somewhere you could go?" she asked him. "For a few weeks. Family, perhaps." "My daughter," he said. "Billings." "I'd go today," she said. "Tell her you're coming for a visit. Don't explain. Just go." He looked at her for a moment. "You think he'll—" "I think a man who has spent a decade engineering other people's ruin does not become cautious when he's cornered," she said. "Go to your daughter, Mr. Pratt." He nodded. He already looked like a different person than the man who'd answered the door, not lighter exactly, but differently weighted, like something had shifted from one side to the other. On the road back toward town, Elias said, "You told him to run." "I told him to be somewhere safe," Clara said. "His statement is in writing and signed. His presence isn't required until the hearing." She paused. "I don't want him where Brooks can reach him in the next 2 weeks. Brooks'll know he talked." "Brooks will figure it out when the hearing happens," she said. "By which point it won't matter what Brooks knows." Elias drove without speaking for a moment. Then, "You think about 10 steps ahead." "I think about what can go wrong," Clara said. "It looks like the same thing, but it isn't." "What's the difference?" "Planning ahead assumes you know the path," she said. "Anticipating failure means you're ready when the path changes." She looked at the road. "The path is going to change. Brooks is going to do something in the next few days that we haven't anticipated. I'd rather have the foundation solid enough to hold when he does." The foundation required one more thing. Greer. She'd been thinking about the foreman since yesterday, turning him over in her mind. The way she turned problems, looking for the angle, the opening, the place where pressure could be applied without pushing the whole structure over. Greer was different from Pratt. Pratt had been a weak man who'd made a bad choice and suffered under it for 4 years. Greer was something else, a man who had actively and repeatedly entered Elias Carter's home and falsified records on behalf of the man who was trying to steal that home. He hadn't been naive. He'd been deliberate. Deliberate men were harder. But deliberate men also had more to lose. "Tell me about Greer," she said to Elias as they came back into Silver Creek's Main Street. "Not what he did, who he is, what matters to him." Elias thought about it. "He's been in this territory about 12 years. He had his own small operation once, a few head of cattle, a lease on some grazing land north of here. The lease lapsed about 8 years ago. I always assumed it was finances. He went to work for my father not long after." Clara filed that away. "The lease lapsed," she said, "or it was taken." He looked at her. "Brooks has been doing this a long time," she said. "Greer might not have come to him. Brooks might have come to Greer when Greer was already in a compromised position." She paused. "That changes what Greer is." "It doesn't change what he did." "No," she agreed. "But it changes why. And that changes how we approach him." The man in question was not difficult to locate. He was working the south pasture fence line of the Brooks property, which ran alongside the county road about a mile outside town, and he looked up when the wagon slowed, and his face went through a rapid and informative series of expressions when he saw who was in it. He started to move away. "Mr. Greer." Clara's voice carried clearly across the distance. "I've spoken with Aldous Pratt." He stopped. He turned around slowly. She got down from the wagon without waiting for assistance and walked across the dry grass toward him, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the particular quality of a man who is trying to decide whether to stand his ground or run, and knows that running will tell her everything. He stood his ground, up close. He was a big man, rangy and sun-darkened, with the hands of someone who had done physical work his entire life. He looked at her with an expression that was defensive and calculating, and underneath both of those, something that looked a great deal like exhaustion. "I don't know what Pratt told you," he said. "He told me everything," Clara said. "In writing, signed." Greer's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to threaten you," she said. "I'm here because I think you understand that the position you're in is not one that improves with time. Brooks is about to accelerate the foreclosure on Broken River Ranch. When this goes to court, and it will go to court, every name in those ledgers comes out. Pratt has already put your name in writing." "Pratt's a drunk," Greer said, but his voice had no real conviction behind it. "Pratt's a drunk with a signed statement and a clear memory of who gave him the instructions," Clara said. "The question name comes out, Mr. Greer. The question is whether you're the man who stayed silent or the man who told the truth." He looked at her. He looked past her at Elias, who had stayed by the wagon leaning against it with his arms crossed, not threatening, just present. "He'll ruin me," Greer said. "He's already ruined you," Clara said, not unkindly. "The question is whether you get ahead of it." Something shifted in Greer's face. Not capitulation, not yet, but a crack in the wall. "The lease," she said quietly. "On your grazing land. 8 years ago. Did it lapse on its own, or did someone engineer the conditions under which it lapsed?" The crack widened. He looked at her for a long time. "He told me he could get it back," Greer said. "The lease. After I did what he needed at the Carter Ranch. He said he had the connections to restore it." He stopped. "He never restored anything." "No," Clara said. "He wouldn't have." Greer's hands opened and closed at his sides. "I spent 4 years working for Josiah Carter," he said. His voice had changed lower, rougher, carrying something that sounded a great deal like genuine shame. "He was a fair man. He was decent to me." He stopped again. "I put false numbers in his books while he was away on business. He died not knowing how much trouble the ranch was in, because of what I put in those books." Clara said nothing. She let him carry it. "I've got a daughter in Silver Creek," he said. "She's 9 years old. Her mother and I aren't together anymore, but I see her on Sundays." He looked at the ground. "I don't want her to know what I did." "Then do something that partially balances it," Clara said. "Not because it erases it. It doesn't. But because it's what's left." He looked up. "Will you write a statement?" she asked. He looked at Elias. "Carter." Elias walked toward them across the dry grass. He stopped a few feet from Greer and looked at the man steadily, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You worked my father for 3 years before you started with the books," Elias said. "Yes." "He trusted you." "Yes." "Then do what she's asking," Elias said. "For whatever reason you want, but do it." Greer's statement was written on the tailgate of Elias's wagon with Elias's pen and a hardcover book from under the seat as a writing surface. It took 20 minutes and covered 4 pages and named every person involved with a specificity that only a participant could provide. When he handed it to Clara, he said, "If he comes for me." "He'll have bigger concerns," she said. She was not certain of that, but she said it with enough conviction that he nodded, and that was what he needed. Back in town, Clara asked Elias to stop the wagon outside Margaret Whitfield's shop. She went in alone. Margaret Whitfield looked up from behind her counter, and something in Clara's face told her this was not a social visit. "I need something from you," Clara said, "and I want to be honest about what I'm asking." "Sit down," Margaret Whitfield said. Clara sat. She laid out what she had. Pratt's statement, Greer's statement, the original property documents, the altered survey, the easement. She laid it out plainly and without drama, the way she'd laid out financial records for her school board, the way she'd explained things to children who needed facts, not softened, just clarified. When she finished, Margaret Whitfield sat with her hands folded on the counter and said, "What do you need from me?" "Your father handled legal filings for this county for 30 years, Clara said. "He knew the territorial court procedures. I need to know whether what I have is enough to bring a case, and I need to know who to bring it to. Not the county land commissioner. That office has been compromised. Higher than that. The Territorial District Court, Margaret Whitfield said immediately. Judge Amos Healy out of Helena. He's an honest man. My father respected him. She paused. But to bring something before Healy, you'd need a territorial attorney to file the petition. There's no one in Silver Creek who'll touch a case against Brooks. Is there someone outside Silver Creek? There's a man in Billings, Margaret Whitfield said slowly. Daniel Forsyth. He's young, but he's capable, and he doesn't have ties to this county. My father corresponded with him on a property matter 2 years ago. She paused. He's also the kind of man who would find this case interesting. Can you write him a letter of introduction? Today, Margaret Whitfield said. She wrote it at her counter, while Clara waited sitting straight-backed on the small stool near the window with her hands folded in her lap. Outside on the main street, Silver Creek went about its afternoon business, and Clara watched the movement of the town and thought about the 3 weeks she had and what they needed to hold. When Margaret Whitfield handed her the letter sealed, she held Clara's hand for a moment. You know that what you're doing will make you enemies in this town, she said. Some people here have depended on Brooks for years. They'll see this as a threat to their arrangements. I know, Clara said, and you're doing it anyway. I came here to build something, Clara said. I meant that. She paused. I just didn't know what I was building. Margaret Whitfield looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who has seen a great many things and has clear opinions about what constitutes character. My father would have liked you, she said simply. Clara took the letter and went back to the wagon. They sent the letter to Billings by the afternoon rider, along with a formal written account Clara had drafted, precise, organized, dated, referenced, outlining the fraud and attaching copies of the key documents. She had spent an hour on the draft at Elias's kitchen table, while he ate a silent lunch, and watched her work with the expression she was coming to recognize as his particular form of attention. That evening, Brooks made his second move. It came in the form of 2 men who appeared at the end of the Broken River Ranch Road, just before dusk, not riding onto the property, not making any explicit threat, just stopping at the road's edge, where they could be seen from the house, and staying there for 20 minutes before riding back toward town. Elias came in from where he'd been watching them from the porch. He sat down at the table across from Clara and picked up his coffee cup. You saw them, she said without looking up from the ledger. Yes. What do you want to do? He thought about it. What do you want to do? She looked up. I want to keep working. He nodded. He picked up a ledger and opened it. Then keep working. She watched him for a moment. This man who had driven her 4 miles out of town 2 days ago, because nobody else was moving, who had stood silent and solid in Pratt's kitchen and Greer's pasture and Harlan Cole's office, who had just watched 2 of Brooks' men park themselves at the end of his road and responded by sitting down across from her and picking up a ledger. Elias, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said. For that first day. At the depot. He looked at her for a moment. Don't thank me for that, he said. That was just what anyone should have done. But no one else did, she said. He had no answer for that. He looked back at the ledger. She looked back at hers. They worked until well past midnight. In the morning, 2 things happened in quick succession, and the first one was almost enough to make Clara doubt the ground she'd built. The first thing was a rider from town who brought a notice signed by the county land commissioner, a man named Aldrich, stating that a formal inquiry into the affairs of Broken River Ranch had been opened and that all financial records held on the property were to be produced for review at the commissioner's office within 5 business days. He's going to take the ledgers, Elias said. Or destroy them, Clara said. She looked at the notice. She looked at the original ledgers stacked on the table. She had copies of the critical pages, but the originals were irreplaceable. I need someone to hold these, she said. Someone outside this county. Margaret Whitfield, Elias said immediately. Or Pratt if he's still here. But he should already be in Billings by now. She paused. Margaret Whitfield, today. He was already getting his hat. She wrapped the 3 original ledgers and the box of loose papers in oilcloth and tied them carefully and held them on her lap in the wagon all the way into town, the way you'd hold something you couldn't afford to lose. Margaret Whitfield received them without question and put them in the back room behind a stack of bolt fabric and said, They'll look here eventually. I know, Clara said, but not before we need them. Can your sister in Bozeman hold something for a week? She can hold it for a year if I ask her. A week should be enough, Clara said. The second thing that happened that morning came as she and Elias were heading back through Silver Creek toward the ranch. They passed the saloon and the door was open and Nathaniel Brooks was standing just inside it. He came out as the wagon passed. Miss Whitmore, he called. Elias kept the wagon moving. Clara put her hand on his arm and he slowed and she turned on the bench to look at Brooks. How was exactly as she'd seen him from a distance the day before, composed, well-dressed, carrying the complete confidence of a man who had never had to talk his way around the fact of his own power, because the power had always done the talking for him. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that must have been handsome once, and was now merely authoritative. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her from outside the saloon, with that assessing quality, recalibrating. You've been busy, he said pleasantly. I have, she agreed. I wanted to offer an alternative, he said. To all of this. You're a capable woman, that's clear. Capable people often find that the most productive path is also the most comfortable one. He paused. I'm prepared to offer Mr. Carter a fair settlement for Broken River Ranch. More than fair. Enough for him to start again somewhere else. And I'd be prepared to offer you a position in a real capacity managing affairs. I could use someone with your abilities. The street was not empty. There were people on the boardwalks. A few had slowed. Clara looked at Nathaniel Brooks for a long moment. You invited me from Boston to be your wife, she said. When you found out I was capable, you sent me a letter and told me not to come to the ranch. He said nothing. Now you're offering me a position managing your affairs because you found out I'm capable, she said. I want you to hear how those two things sound next to each other. His composure didn't crack. It was too well built for that. But something shifted behind his eyes. The foreclosure will proceed, he said. Whatever documents you think you've found. The documents I've found, Clara said, are originals, pre-existing your alterations, held privately for years by a man who is no longer alive to be pressured. She paused. I've also spoken with Aldous Pratt, and with your former employee, Mr. Greer. She watched his face carefully. I'd recommend you speak with your lawyer today, Mr. Brooks. The Territorial District Court in Helena takes fraud cases seriously. The word Helena did what she'd intended it to do. The county commissioner was his. The county bank was his. But the territorial court was not his, and they both knew it. For the first time, she saw something move through his composure that wasn't calculated. You should be careful, he said quietly. This territory has a way of being unkind to people who don't understand it. I've been unkind to people who underestimated me, Clara said. It seems we both have our risks. Elias clicked to the horse and the wagon moved on, and Clara did not look back. Her hands were completely steady. Her heart was not, but that was between her and the wagon bench, and she did not let it reach her face. He threatened you, Elias said, after they'd cleared the main street. He issued a warning, she said. There's a difference. Is there? A threat is what someone says when they've decided to act, she said. A warning is what someone says when they're still deciding. He hasn't decided yet. She paused. He's going to check whether Pratt really talked. Then he's going to try to find the ledgers. Then he'll find out they're gone. That's when he'll decide. And when he decides, we'll have the response from Billings by then, she said. If Forsyth moves on the petition this week, you're counting on a lawyer you've never met moving fast enough to outrun a man who has owned this county for 15 years. I'm counting on a capable lawyer understanding that a case, this well-documented, doesn't come along often, she said. And I'm counting on the fact that Brooks has been doing this long enough that he's gotten comfortable. Comfortable men make mistakes. They were on the ranch road now, coming up the rise toward the house. He'll come after Greer, she said. I should have told him to leave sooner. I'll go back, Elias said. This afternoon. Make sure he gets out. She nodded. He pulled the wagon up to the house and got down and stood beside it for a moment, looking at the ranch. His land, his father's land, the buildings that needed paint, and the fences that needed work, and the water access that had been cut off, and the 12 acres of grazing land that had been fenced away. "My father built this from nothing," he said. "He came here from Missouri with 2 horses and a tent and worked this land for 30 years. Clara had stepped down from the wagon. She stood beside it and looked at him. "He didn't die knowing it was being taken," Elias said. His voice was very even, but she could hear what was underneath it. "At least there's that." "He also didn't die knowing someone was going to take it back," she said. He looked at her. "You're going to keep this ranch," she said. "I want to say that plainly, because I don't think anyone has said it to you plainly yet. The evidence is strong enough. The case will hold. Broken River Ranch will still be yours when this is done." He looked at her for a long time, the look of a man who had been fighting alone for so long that a direct statement of confidence felt like a language he'd half forgotten. "You sound very certain," he said. "I am certain," she said. "I don't say things I'm not certain of." He held her gaze for a moment more. Then he nodded short, real the nod of a man who has decided to believe something. He went to take care of the horse. She went inside to the table and the ledgers and the work. The response from Daniel Forsyth in Billings arrived on the 6th day. It was 4 pages long, written in a clear, precise hand, and it said that he had reviewed the materials, that the documentation was among the most complete evidence of territorial land fraud he had encountered in 7 years of practice, and that he would be filing a petition with Judge Amos Healy in Helena within the week. He also wrote in the final paragraph that the case would require a key witness, someone with first-hand knowledge of Brooks's operations, who was willing to testify. Pratt's written statement and Greer's written statement were valuable, he wrote, but a court hearing of this nature would be significantly strengthened by testimony given in person. Clara read the letter twice. Then she set it down and looked at the window. She had been in Silver Creek for 8 days. 8 days ago, she had been standing on the depot platform with a letter in her hand and the whole town watching. She picked up the letter again and read the final paragraph again. Then she went to find Elias and tell him what came next. He was in the yard mending fence, and he looked up as she came out. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. His expression went through several things that she watched carefully. Relief at the opening paragraph, concentration in the middle, and then a settling in the last paragraph as he reached the part about the testimony. He looked up. "Pratt's in Billings," he said. "He could testify. He's already written the statement." "It's not Pratt I'm thinking of," she said. He looked at her. "The most powerful testimony in that courtroom," she said carefully, "will not be from a man who altered a survey. It will be from someone who can speak to the pattern, to the method, to the totality of what Brooks has done in this county and how long he's done it." She paused. "Is there anyone in Silver Creek who has lost land to Brooks and knows it and would stand up in a territorial courtroom and say so?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Margaret Whitfield." Clara looked at him. "Her father," he said slowly. "He represented 3 families in this county who lost land to boundary disputes in the last decade. He believed those disputes were manufactured. He said so to me once, not long before he died. He said he couldn't prove it, but he knew it." He paused. "If those families would testify, and if Margaret Whitfield would testify about what her father knew and what his records show." "That's the pattern," Clara said. "That's the pattern," he said. She looked at the letter in his hand, and then out at the land around the ranch, the dry summer grass, the fence lines, the distant mountains. "There's a harvest festival in 2 weeks," she said. "Before the hearing date. The whole county will be there." "Every year," he said. "Brooks will be there," she said. He looked at her slowly. "I want him to think he's still winning," she said. "Until the moment he isn't." Elias looked at her for a long time, with the particular expression of a man who has just fully understood something he had been only partially understanding for 8 days. "Clara," he said. "Yes. Are you planning to do what I think you're planning to do?" She looked at him steadily. "What do you think I'm planning to do?" He looked at the letter. He looked at the land. He looked at her. "I think," he said slowly, "that you're planning to let Nathaniel Brooks stand up at the Harvest Festival in front of the entire county and declare that he's won." And then you're going to show him in public in front of every person in Silver Creek exactly what you've built in the last 2 weeks." She said nothing. "That's either the bravest thing I've ever heard," he said, "or the most dangerous." "Those aren't always different," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he folded the letter and handed it back to her. "What do you need me to do?" he said. The 2 weeks before the festival were the longest and the shortest of Clara's life simultaneously. Long, because every day carried the particular weight of waiting. Waiting for confirmation from Forsyth in Billings. Waiting to hear whether Pratt had stayed safe. Waiting to see what Brooks's next move would be, and from which direction it would come. Short, because there was never enough time in any given day to do everything that needed doing, and she went to sleep each night with items still on her list, and woke each morning already thinking about them before her feet hit the floor. Elias noticed. He didn't comment on it directly. He wasn't a man who commented on things directly when silence would do. But she would come out to the kitchen some mornings to find the coffee already made and a plate of something on the table beside her working papers, set there by someone who had gotten up earlier than her and thought about what she needed. She never mentioned it. Neither did he. But it was the kind of small, consistent attentiveness that a person felt even when they weren't looking for it, and she felt it. Margaret Whitfield agreed to everything within the first 10 minutes of the conversation. Clara had gone to the shop alone on a Tuesday morning, and she had laid out the full plan, and Margaret Whitfield had listened with her hands folded and her expression completely composed. And when Clara finished, the older woman said, "The Harmon family and the Pickett family. Those were two of the families my father represented in the boundary disputes. The Harmons lost 40 acres of riverland, and the Pickett family lost water access rights. Both of them know it was wrong. Neither of them believed they had any recourse." "Would they speak to me?" Clara asked. "They'd speak to me first," Margaret Whitfield said. "I'll go to them." She went that same afternoon. By Thursday, Clara had sat across a kitchen table from both families. The Harmons in their farmhouse north of town, the Picketts on their smaller property east of the creek, and both conversations had the same shape as the ones with Pratt and Greer, the same progression from guarded to careful to quiet anger, finally allowed out into the open. The Harmons had lost their riverland 8 years ago. The Picketts had lost their water access 5 years ago. Both had been told by the county recording office that the paperwork was in order. Both had suspected otherwise, and had no way to prove it and no resources to fight. Both agreed to testify. Daniel Forsyth arrived from Billings on the Friday before the festival. He was younger than Clara had expected, maybe 32, with an alert, intelligent face, and the manner of a man who was accustomed to moving quickly through complicated information. He arrived on the afternoon train, came directly to Broken River Ranch, and spent 3 hours at the kitchen table with Clara, going through every piece of evidence, asking sharp, precise questions that told her he had read her account carefully and was now checking his understanding against the reality. At the end of 3 hours, he sat back and said, "This is the most thoroughly prepared case I've received as a starting point. Usually I'm building from the ground up." "I'm a school teacher," Clara said. "I know how to organize information." "You're more than a school teacher," Forsyth said, and said it plainly, as a professional observation, not a compliment. The petition to Judge Healy was filed 2 days ago. Healy has agreed to take the case. The hearing is in 3 weeks in Helena. He paused. Brooks will be served his notice within the week. Once he's served, he'll understand that this is no longer something he can manage at the county level. "What will he do?" Elias asked. He was at the end of the table where he'd been throughout the conversation, present, following everything but letting Clara lead. "He'll try to discredit the witnesses," Forsyth said. "Pratt first, he'll argue Pratt is an unreliable drunk. Then Greer, he'll argue Greer is a disgruntled former employee. Then the Harmons and Picketts, he'll argue they're simply unhappy with legitimate legal outcomes." He looked at Clara. "The documentation is what he can't easily attack, especially the originals from Whitfield's files. Those predate his interference, and they're unimpeachable." "And my testimony," Clara said. Forsyth looked at her steadily. "You're his most significant problem," he said. "You are a woman with no prior connection to this county, no personal grievance against him that predates your arrival, and a professional background in financial management. You came here with no purpose, except to marry a man who rejected you, and instead of leaving you uncovered systematic fraud. That is an extraordinarily difficult narrative for him to attack. He'll try, Elias said. He'll try, Forsyth agreed. He'll argue you arrived with an agenda, that you manufactured or misread the evidence, that your relationship with Mr. Carter has influenced your interpretation of the records. He paused. None of those arguments will survive contact with the originals from Whitfield's files, but he'll make them. Let him, Clara said. Forsyth left the next morning for Helena to continue the preparation. He shook Clara's hand at the wagon and said, I'll be in contact before the hearing. Keep everything safe. It's already safe, she said. It was. The originals were with Margaret Whitfield's sister in Bozeman. Copies were with Forsyth. Copies were with Clara. The signed statements from Pratt and Greer were with Forsyth and with Margaret Whitfield separately. Clara had built the evidence like she built everything, with enough redundancy that losing any single piece wouldn't compromise the structure. The festival notice was served to Brooks 2 days before the harvest celebration. She found out because Jim Tabor at the feed store told Elias, who came home and told her, and for the first time she saw something on Elias Carter's face that she hadn't seen before. Not anxiety, but a kind of fierce, focused attention, like a man who has been waiting for the bell and has just heard it ring. He knows, Elias said. Yes, Clara said. He'll be at the festival. I'm counting on it, she said. The morning of the festival. Clara was up before dawn. She was not nervous in the way she'd expected to be nervous, not the loose, uncontrolled feeling she'd feared. Instead, she had the particular clarity of someone who has prepared as thoroughly as they know how and has decided to trust that preparation. Every document was accounted for. Every witness knew what was expected of them. Margaret Whitfield had been briefed. The Harmons and Picketts would be at the festival. Forsyth's written summary of the case, clear, organized one page, was folded inside Clara's coat along with the key copies. Elias knocked on her door at 5:30. You ready? He asked through the door. Nearly, she said. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the chest of drawers. She had pressed her best dress the night before, deep blue wool, the better of the two she'd brought from Boston. She had done her hair carefully. She looked like what she was, a capable woman who had decided to be entirely herself in public without apology. She opened the chest of drawers and took out the rejection letter. She held it for a moment. The arrangement is no longer possible. Do not come to the ranch. She put it back. She closed the drawer. She went out. Elias was at the wagon. He looked at her when she came out, and something moved across his face that he didn't try to manage or explain. He simply held her gaze for a moment and then said, You look ready. I am, she said. She was. Silver Creek's annual Harvest Festival occupied the town square and spilled out into the Main Street tables loaded with food music from a fiddle player. Near the church steps, children running between the legs of adults who were trying to talk business and society simultaneously. It was the kind of gathering that a small western town mounted with genuine collective effort, and the result had real warmth to it, real community, the kind that reminded Clara that Silver Creek was not only the people who had laughed at her on the platform. It was also Margaret Whitfield and Jim Tabor at the feed store, and the Harmon family, and the Pickett family, and all the ordinary people who had nothing to do with Brooks's schemes and simply lived their lives in this territory as best they could. She and Elias arrived mid-morning. People noticed them immediately, some with curiosity, some with the particular awkward awareness of people who had laughed or whispered 2 weeks ago and were now unsure what posture to take. Clara gave no one the opportunity to be uncomfortable. She nodded. She greeted people. She accepted a cup of lemonade from a woman she didn't know and said thank you and meant it. Margaret Whitfield found her within 10 minutes. He's here, she said quietly from beside Clara. He arrived 20 minutes ago. He's been working the crowd. He looks... She paused. He looks like a man who has decided something. I know, Clara said. The Harmons are near the church steps. The Picketts are at the food tables. They know to follow your lead. Thank you, Clara said. She looked around the square. She found Brooks without difficulty, He was in the center of a small cluster of men near the bandstand, talking with the ease of someone who is performing ease rather than feeling it. He was dressed well as always, and he was smiling, and from a distance, he looked like a man who had not a concern in the world. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. The smile stayed, but something behind it changed. For the next 2 hours, the festival played out with the tension of two people who are both aware they are in the same room and both deciding when to move. Clara talked to people. She was gracious and warm and interested in what they said to her because she genuinely was. These were the people of the community she had decided to be part of, and their lives and concerns were real and interesting and worth her attention. She did not perform patience. She simply was patient because the moment would come when it came and not before. Elias stayed near her without crowding her. He talked to men he knew, neighboring ranchers, the feed store owner, a couple of cowboys from an outfit north of town, and he did it naturally without apparent strategy. And she watched from the corner of her eye how people responded to him. They respected him. Not in the elaborate, cultivated way they responded to Brooks, but in the quieter, more durable way people respond to someone they've known to be reliable over years. She filed that away. The thing that changed everything happened just before noon. Brooks moved to the bandstand. It was not an official part of the festival program, but it was the kind of thing he could do, the kind of casual authority that had been unchallenged for so long it had become invisible. He stood on the first step of the bandstand, and he raised his voice in the way of a man accustomed to being heard, and the crowd around him shifted naturally in his direction. "I want to say something about this community," he said, "about what makes Silver Creek what it is. We've built something real here, something worth protecting." He paused. Sometimes people come into a community like ours with intentions that aren't what they appear. Sometimes a person arrives claiming to help, and what they're actually doing is stirring up trouble for their own purposes. The square had gone gradually quieter as he spoke the way crowds do when someone with authority begins to address them. Clara did not move. "I think most of you know who I'm speaking about," Brooks continued. His voice was measured and regretful, the voice of a man reluctantly addressing a problem. "A woman arrived in this town 2 weeks ago, rejected by a man who decided she wasn't suited to this life. Instead of accepting that judgment and moving on, she's decided to make trouble. She's been visiting people in this county, vulnerable people, elderly people, and putting words in their mouths, encouraging them to make claims that have no basis in fact." He looked directly at Clara. The crowd looked at her too. She felt every eye in the square, the same way they'd found her on the platform 2 weeks ago, and she felt the weight of it, which was real, and she let it be real, and she did not step back. "This woman," Brooks said, "came here on the basis of a business arrangement that was dissolved when it became clear she was not who she represented herself to be. And now, rather than leave with the dignity appropriate to her situation, Mr. Brooks," her voice was not loud. She didn't need it to be loud. The square was quiet enough that she barely needed to raise it at all, and there was something in the quality of it, not anger, not trembling, not performance, that made people who had started looking at Brooks look back at her. She walked toward the bandstand. The crowd parted for her the way crowds do when someone moves with complete certainty about where they're going. She stopped perhaps 10 feet from him. "You are correct about one thing," she said. She was looking at him directly, and her voice was as level as she could make it, which was very level indeed. "I arrived here because of an arrangement you dissolved." She reached into her coat. She took out the documents. Not all of them. She had been strategic about what she'd brought today. What would read clearly to a public audience that included people with no legal training. She held up the original deed to Broken River Ranch and the original survey. "I was dissolved," she said, "because you realized I was capable of doing exactly what I have been doing for the past 2 weeks. Reading your books, finding your alterations, talking to the people you paid to falsify records on your behalf." The square was very quiet. "These are original documents," she said clearly, so that the people at the edges of the crowd could hear. "They predate the alterations made to the county records. They show the original property boundaries of Broken River Ranch boundaries that were changed 4 years ago by a surveyor named Aldous Pratt, who has provided a signed and witnessed statement confirming that he was paid by your associate Mercer to falsify the correction." Brooks' composure had not cracked. He was too practiced for that. But she could see the recalculation happening in his face, a rapid, urgent reassessment of the terrain. "These are the claims of a desperate woman," he began. "These are original documents," she said again simply. "You can say whatever you like about me. You cannot say anything about these documents because they predate your interference, and they were held privately for 15 years by a man who kept better records than you anticipated." She looked out at this crowd. She wasn't reading it the way an actress reads an audience. She was looking at it the way a teacher looks at a classroom, assessing where the understanding was landing, where it needed more, who was following, and who was still resistant. "Many of you know the Harmon family," she said, "and the Pickett family." She turned slightly. The Harmons were near the church steps. Robert Harmon, 62 years old, who had farmed this territory for 30 years, who had lost 40 acres of riverland to a boundary dispute he'd always known was wrong. He looked at Clara when she turned, and he straightened slightly, and he nodded. "The Harmon family lost 40 acres of riverland 8 years ago," she said. "They were told the survey showed the boundary had always been where it was changed to. The original survey which I am holding says otherwise." She heard a sound move through the crowd. Not loud. The particular sound of an audience absorbing a fact that reorders what they thought they knew. Brooks stepped down from the bandstand. One step toward her, and the movement was controlled, but it was the first involuntary thing he'd done, a forward move driven by urgency rather than strategy. "The Territorial District Court in Helena," she said before he could speak, "has accepted a petition filed by attorney Daniel Forsyth of Billings, outlining fraud charges relating to the systematic falsification of property records in this county. The hearing date has been set." She looked at Brooks. "You've spent 15 years building something in this county," she said. "I know that. It's real, and it took work, and some of it was legitimate. But some of it, the part built on other people's land, on manufactured debt, on falsified surveys and corrupted records, that part is going to be examined by a territorial court. And it will not survive that examination." The silence in the square was the particular silence of a large number of people processing something simultaneously. Brooks looked at her. His face had settled into something she hadn't seen on it before, not the cultivated pleasantness, not the calculated authority. Just a man looking at something he hadn't been able to manage, which was a new experience for him, and it showed. "You don't know what you've started," he said quietly enough that it didn't carry to the crowd, just to her. "I know exactly what I've started," she said at the same volume. "I started it when I read a letter on a train platform and decided not to go back to Boston." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned and walked through the crowd toward the edge of the square, and people stepped aside for him, but differently than they had before. Not with the automatic deference of people accustomed to his authority, but with the more cautious give of people who are recalculating what that authority means. When he was gone, the square was very quiet for a moment. Then Robert Harmon walked forward from near the church steps. He stopped beside Clara, and he looked out at the assembled town neighbors, some of whom he'd known for 30 years, and he said, "She's telling the truth about our land. My father died believing he'd lost that acreage fair and square. He hadn't." His voice cracked slightly on the last sentence. Just slightly. His wife took his arm. Clara looked at Elias. I was standing about 15 feet from her, exactly where he'd been throughout, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the measured steadiness, not the careful reserve. Something open and unguarded and entirely real. She looked away. She looked at the crowd, at the faces of Silver Creek, at the people who had watched her on the platform 2 weeks ago and were watching her now, and the difference between those two watchings was the whole distance of what had happened in between. Margaret Whitfield appeared at her side. "You should know," she said quietly, "that Jim Tabor's wife has already told 3 people she always thought the Harmon boundary situation was suspicious. And the minister's wife is talking to the Pickett family." She paused. "The narrative is moving." "Good," Clara said. "Are you all right?" Margaret Whitfield asked. Clara thought about that honestly. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right." She was. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. What was happening inside her chest was complicated and real, and she would examine it later in private when there was time. For now, there was work still to do. She was right about that. Because 20 minutes later, Elias appeared at her side with a look she'd learned to read, contained serious. The look that meant something had happened that she needed to know. "Cole," he said quietly. "He's over by the water trough. He wants to talk to you." She looked across the square. Harlan Cole, the bank manager, was standing apart from the crowd with the posture of a man who has made a decision and is now committed to it, and is trying not to look like he's about to do something that frightens him. She went to him. He looked at her when she reached him, and he said without preamble, "I spoke with a lawyer in Helena 3 days ago. My own counsel. Independent." He paused. "The acceleration notice I filed on Broken River Ranch, I've withdrawn it." Clara looked at him. "The original loan documentation," he said, "does not support foreclosure. The annotation suggesting the terms had been modified. I've examined it more carefully. It was added to the ledger at some point after the original entries. The ink is different." He stopped. "I should have seen that before." "Yes," Clara said. "You should have." He absorbed that without defending himself, which she respected. "The foreclosure is withdrawn," he said again. "I'll have the paperwork processed by Monday." "Mr. Cole," she said, "when the territorial court begins its examination of the bank's records, your cooperation with their inquiry will matter considerably." "I understand that," he said. "And Dawes," she said, "the county recording official who processed the falsified survey amendment." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Dawes submitted his resignation to the county commissioner this morning," he said. "I heard it from the commissioner's clerk an hour ago." Clara absorbed that. Dawes had seen which way the wind was moving before the festival even started. His resignation was self-protection, the act of a man trying to get ahead of the exposure. But it was also evidence because innocent men in legitimate positions don't resign the morning of the day a public confrontation is expected. "That's useful," she said. "Miss Whitmore," Cole said, and his voice carried something she hadn't heard in it before. "What you did today standing up there." He stopped. "There are people in this town who've suspected about Brooks for years, longer than I want to admit. But suspicion without proof isn't courage, it's just discomfort." He paused. "What you had today was proof." She looked at him steadily. "What I had today was work," she said. 2 weeks of it." She left him standing by the water trough and walked back toward the main part of the square, and she felt not triumph exactly. Something quieter and more solid. The particular feeling of a thing that has been built properly and is standing. Elias fell into step beside her. "Cole withdrew the foreclosure," she said. "I heard some of it," he said. "And Dawes resigned this morning." He stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him. "It's over," he said. It was not quite a question. "The festival part of it is over," she said. "The legal part takes 3 weeks. The hearing in Helena, the court's findings, the process of restoring what Brooks took from the Harmons and the Picketts that takes longer." She paused. "But the ranch is safe. As of this morning, the foreclosure has been withdrawn. Broken River Ranch is yours." Elias Carter stood in the middle of the Silver Creek Harvest Festival, with his hat in his hands, and the whole town moving around them, and something crossed his face that she had not seen there before. Something that went through his composure completely, and didn't apologize for it. He looked away, just for a moment. He looked at the far edge of the square at some middle distance, and she looked away too, giving him that moment because she understood that some things a person needs to have without an audience, even when they're standing in the middle of a crowd. Then he looked back. "My father worked this land for 30 years, he said. "I know," she said. "He deserved better than what was done to him." "He did," she said. "And the court is going to say so." I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need next?" She appreciated that more than she could say. Not "what do you need from me" or "how can I help," just the simple, direct, forward moving. "What do you need next?" As if the only question was about continuation, about the next thing on the list, about what came after this. "I need to speak with the Harmons again before they leave," she said. "And I want to check in with Margaret Whitfield about coordinating the witness preparation with Forsyth before the Helena hearing." She paused. "And I need to eat something because I haven't since breakfast." Something that was definitively a smile crossed his face this time, real and unhurried. "There's a pie table near the church," he said. "Lead the way," she said. He did, and as they walked through the festival together, through the people of Silver Creek, some of whom nodded, and some of whom looked, and some of whom were still deciding what to think, Clara was aware of the distance between this and the platform 2 weeks ago. Not as something sentimental, just as a fact, as the specific measurable distance between where she had been and where she was. She had arrived in Silver Creek with $12.43 and a letter that told her she was unwanted. She was walking through Silver Creek now, with the evidence that had shifted everything, with the sound of the Harmon family talking to their neighbors about a boundary they'd lost 8 years ago, with Nathaniel Brooks gone from the square, and Harlan Cole having withdrawn a foreclosure notice and a court date set in Helena. She had not built this alone, but she had started it, and that she thought was exactly enough. She did not see as they reached the pie table, and Elias picked up 2 plates with the matter-of-fact ease of a man doing an ordinary thing, that he was watching her, not in the assessing way of the first day, not the recalibrating way of the days that followed. In the particular way of someone looking at something they have realized matters to them, in a way they are not yet ready to put into words. She would see it eventually. But that was still to come. For now, there was pie and the Harvest Festival, and 3 weeks until Helena, and the solid, real feeling of a foundation that had been built right. The 3 weeks between the Harvest Festival and the Helena hearing were nothing like the 2 weeks before it. Before the festival, every day had carried urgency. The specific, forward-driving urgency of someone building something against a deadline, of someone who knew the ground could shift at any moment and was racing to pour the foundation before it did. Clara had thrived in that. She was built for it. The pressure had felt like fuel. After the festival, the urgency didn't disappear, but it changed shape. The legal machinery had been set in motion, and Forsyth was running it, which meant Clara's role shifted from builder to witness, and that shift was harder than she'd expected. She was not accustomed to being the person who waited. She had spent her adult life being the person who acted, and sitting at Elias's kitchen table in the evenings, going over testimony preparation, while the actual decisions were happening in Helena, felt like wearing a coat that didn't quite fit. Elias noticed. Of course he noticed. "You're doing that thing again," he said one evening. He was across the table going over the ranch accounts, the real accounts, the ones Clara had reconstructed from the original records, which now made sense, and painted a picture that was difficult, but not hopeless. "What thing?" she said. "Where you read the same page 4 times, he said without looking up. She looked down at the letter from Forsyth she'd been holding. She had in fact read it 4 times. "The waiting is harder than the working," she said. "For some people," he said. He looked up then. "You did the work, Clara. Now you let it stand." She looked at him. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without decoration, like a fact about weather or fencing. And it landed the way simple, true things do, when the person saying them means every word and is not performing meaning. She put the letter down. "Tell me where we are with the east pasture fence," she said. He looked at her for a moment with something that was almost amusement. Then he told her about the east pasture fence, and they talked about the ranch for the rest of the evening, and it was better than staring at Forsyth's letter. That was the other thing that had shifted. They talked differently now. Not about evidence and documents and strategy, though those conversations still happened, but about the ranch and what it needed and what was possible. Elias would tell her about a section of grazing land, and she'd ask about the soil, and he'd explain things about cattle and land management that she found genuinely interesting, and she'd tell him about the account structure she was building to replace his father's compromised books, and he'd ask questions about it that were practical and intelligent, and showed he'd been paying more attention to the financial logic than he let on. One morning she came out to find him at the table with one of the ledgers open, and he'd been trying to follow the reconciliation she'd built for the previous month, and he looked up when she came in with the slightly defensive expression of someone who's been caught doing something they hadn't admitted to wanting to do. "I'm trying to understand how you track the cattle costs separately from the land maintenance," he said. She sat down across from him. "Show me where you got confused." He showed her. She explained it. He asked another question. She answered it. He nodded slowly, working it through, and she watched him think the particular focused quality he brought to everything. that willingness to sit with something until it made sense, and she thought that this was the kind of man her father would have respected. The kind who didn't pretend to understanding he didn't have, and didn't stop until he did have it. She was thinking about her father more lately, about her mother, about Boston and the school and the life she'd been living before she made the decision to answer Nathaniel Brooks's first letter. That life felt very far away, not in a painful way, just distant like a room she'd left and closed the door to and standing outside it. Now she wasn't sure she could explain to anyone exactly what had changed, except that she had. The night before they left for Helena, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the back room with the quilt pulled up and the dark of the Montana night outside the window, and she thought about what the next day meant. The hearing, Forsyth and Judge Healy, and the documented evidence laid out before a territorial court. Brooks on the other side of a courtroom with his lawyer, doing exactly what Forsyth had predicted he would do, attacking the witnesses, attacking the documentation, attacking her specifically with everything he could construct. She thought about standing up in that courtroom. She thought about what Brooks would say about her. She thought about whether she was afraid. She decided she was not afraid exactly. She was the particular thing that exists just on the far side of fear. The state of someone who has looked at what frightens them and decided to walk directly into it. She got up. She went to the chest of drawers and opened the top drawer and took out the letter. She read it in the dark by the window, holding it up to the faint light from outside, and the words were the same. They had always been. The arrangement is no longer possible. Do not come to the ranch. I trust you'll manage your return arrangements accordingly. She folded it one more time. She put it in her coat pocket. She would take it to Helena with her. Not to show anyone, not as evidence, just as the thing it had always been, the document of the moment that had sent her accidentally and irrevocably in the direction of everything that followed. A knock at her door. Clara. Elias's voice quiet through the wood. She went to the door and opened it. He was fully dressed, which meant he hadn't slept either, and he was holding 2 cups of coffee with the practical air of a man who had decided that if sleep wasn't available, coffee was the next best thing. She took the cup without speaking. They sat at the kitchen table in the dark, in the quiet of the ranch at 3 in the morning, and neither of them said anything for a while. The coffee was hot and strong and real, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. "I've been thinking about my father," Elias said eventually. "So have I," she said. He looked at her. "About what he built," she said, "and what almost happened to it, and what doesn't happen to it now." She paused. "He would have wanted you to keep this land." "He didn't think I could," Elias said. It was a plain statement delivered without self-pity. "He loved me, but he didn't think I had the head for the business side of it. He said so near the end. He said he was sorry he hadn't figured out a better way to set me up for what came after." "He was wrong," Clara said. "I wasn't entirely wrong," Elias said. "I didn't figure it out." "You couldn't have," she said. "The system that was designed to take this ranch was designed by someone who knew exactly where your vulnerabilities were. It wasn't a failure of your intelligence. It was a failure of your access." She looked at him directly. "You needed someone who knew how to read what he'd built. That wasn't available to you." "Until it was," he said. "Until it was," she agreed. He looked at his coffee. "I want you to know something," he said. "Before tomorrow, in case the hearing doesn't go." "It will go well," she said. "Clara." She stopped. "I want you to know," he said again, "that whatever happens in that courtroom, whatever the outcome is, you changed something here. You changed the ranch. You changed what I understand about my own situation. And you changed—" He stopped. I was not a man who found certain territories of language easy, and she could see him working toward something that was just outside his habitual range. "You changed what I thought was possible," he said finally. "For this place. For me." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the dark at 3 in the morning, 2 cups of coffee between them. She understood that he was saying something that had more than one layer. She understood that they had been living in each other's daily space for 3 weeks, and that something had grown in that space that neither of them had named or planned for. She understood that he was not asking her anything. Not tonight, not with the hearing in the morning. He was simply telling her a true thing, because he'd decided she should know it before they walked into tomorrow. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. "I stayed," she said simply. He was quiet. "I had $12.43 and a letter that told me I wasn't wanted," she said. "I could have found a way back to Boston. I could have gone to the territorial capital and found work. I'm a capable woman. There's always work for capable women who'll accept less than their worth, and I'd been doing that for years." She paused. "I stayed because this felt like the place that was actually meant for me. Not because of a man's promise. Because of what I found when I started looking." She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere, Elias. The ranch doesn't go back to Boston. I don't go back to Boston. Whatever this is, whatever we're building here, I'm in it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Good," and meant it in the way that quiet men mean big things with small words. They finished their coffee. They went to Helena. The Territorial District Court of Montana was housed in a building that took itself seriously. Stone facade, high ceilings, the whole atmosphere of institutional permanence that Clara suspected was designed to make individuals feel appropriately small. She did not feel small. She felt the same thing she'd felt walking toward the bandstand at the Harvest Festival, the complete grounded certainty of someone who has done the preparation and is ready for what comes next. Forsyth met them outside. He looked at Clara and said, "You ready?" And she said yes. And he looked at her face and said, "Good," with the same professional confidence he'd had at the kitchen table 3 weeks ago. Brooks was already inside. She saw him when they entered at the opposite end of the room, with his lawyer, a man from Billings, whom Forsyth had identified as capable but conventional. Brooks was dressed impeccably, and his posture was the posture of a man performing certainty. And she studied him from across the room and tried to read what was underneath the performance. He was afraid. Not the way she'd been afraid the night before. Not the productive, clarifying fear of someone who respects what they're walking into. The afraid of someone who has looked at their position and found it less solid than they had believed. Good, she thought. Judge Amos Healy was exactly what Margaret Whitfield's description had led her to expect, 60 deliberate, with the quiet authority of someone who had been making difficult decisions for 30 years and had no interest in theater. He called the hearing to order without ceremony, and Forsyth opened without preamble, and what followed was 4 hours of some of the most focused professional work Clara had ever witnessed. Forsyth was extraordinary in that courtroom. He laid the evidence out the way Clara had built it systematically, clearly, each piece connected to the next. He introduced the original deed, the original survey, the Whitfield documents. He walked Judge Healy through the altered entries in the ledgers, the ink differences, the handwriting variation, the pattern of timing that corresponded precisely with Josiah Carter's travel schedule. He introduced Pratt's written statement, Greer's written statement. He called Robert Harmon to testify about the 40 acres of riverland, and Harmon spoke plainly and without embellishment in the voice of a man who had been waiting 8 years for a room where his story would be taken seriously. Brooks's lawyer attacked. He attacked Pratt's credibility. He attacked Greer's motivation. He argued the documents were misread, misinterpreted, assembled by a woman with a personal grievance against his client. And then Forsyth called Clara. She walked to the front of the courtroom, and she was aware of every eye in the room. Judge Healy's, Forsyth's, the court clerk's, and across the room Brooks, and she sat down, and she was steady. Forsyth asked her to describe her professional background. She described it. He asked her to describe the circumstances of her arrival in Silver Creek. She described them without drama, in the same voice she'd used for everything clear and factual, and entirely without performance. He asked her how she had come to examine the Broken River Ranch accounts. "Mr. Carter told me the books had never made sense to him," she said. "He had the records but lacked the background to identify what was wrong with them. I had that background. I offered to look at them in exchange for room and board while I determined my next situation." She paused. "What I found was not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Forsyth asked. "Disorder," she said. "Poor record keeping. The kind of financial confusion that results from someone managing accounts they aren't suited to manage." She paused. "What I found instead was deliberate falsification. The distinction is important because disorder is random. Falsification has a pattern. Once I saw the pattern, I could follow it. She followed it in the courtroom, the way she'd followed it at Elias's kitchen table, tracing each piece to the next showing. Judge Healy exactly where each alteration was and what it accomplished, and how the cumulative effect had been designed to appear as natural financial decline, rather than engineered theft. Brooks's lawyer cross-examined her for 40 minutes. How was precise and aggressive, and he tried every angle she had anticipated: the personal grievance, the professional overreach, the accusation that her relationship with Elias Carter compromised her analysis. She answered every question with the same composed, factual certainty. At one point he said, "Miss Whitmore, isn't it true that you arrived in this territory as a rejected mail-order bride, with nothing, no home, no resources, no standing in this community, and that your involvement in these matters was an attempt to manufacture standing you hadn't earned?" The courtroom was very quiet. She looked at him steadily. "I arrived in this territory as a woman who had been misled by your client," she said. "I had $12 a trunk of books and a professional background that your client failed to account for when he decided I was manageable." She paused. "The standing I have in this community, such as it is, was not manufactured. It was the result of the work described in the evidence before this court." She looked at Brooks directly for the first time since the hearing had started, and she held his gaze. "Your client sent me back to the depot because he decided I was too capable to be useful to him. That decision led directly to this courtroom. I would suggest the question of what I have or haven't earned is one he should have considered more carefully." The silence held for a beat. Then Judge Healy made a note. Brooks's lawyer had no follow-up question. The hearing concluded at 4 in the afternoon. Judge Healy took the documentation for review and stated he would issue his findings within 10 days. His face throughout the proceeding had been the careful neutral of a professional adjudicator, revealing nothing. But at the end, as he gathered his papers, he looked up once and looked at the evidence file Forsyth had assembled, and then at Clara, and the look held something she interpreted carefully and without overreading it as the recognition of a man who had just seen something thorough. Outside the courthouse, Forsyth shook her hand. "I'll be in contact the moment the findings come," he said. "I'm confident." He paused. "Which is not something I say as a matter of courtesy." She believed him. Elias brought the wagon around, and she climbed up, and they drove out of Helena in the late afternoon and were mostly quiet for the first few miles. The way they'd been quiet on the drive to Silver Creek a month ago, but so differently. That first silence had been the silence of strangers. This one was the silence of two people who have fought the same fight and are now sitting in the specific quiet of the aftermath. "How do you feel?" he said eventually. She thought about it honestly. "Like something is finished," she said. "Not resolved yet, but finished." "That's about right," he said. She looked at the road ahead, the long dry road back toward Silver Creek, toward the ranch, toward the kitchen table, and the ledgers, and the east pasture fence that needed work. Toward the life that had assembled itself around her in the weeks since a train platform and a cream envelope and a station master's hand. "Elias," she said. When this is resolved, the hearing the court's findings, all of it." She paused. "What do you want for the ranch? Not what you want to save, what you want to build." He was quiet for a long moment, driving. She didn't push it. She'd learned when he was thinking and when he was avoiding, and this was thinking. "More cattle," he said. "The east pasture, once the fence is sound, it could support twice what we're running now. And the water access once it's restored." He paused. "My father always said the creek access was the ranch's best asset. He built around it. I want to build toward it again." She said. He glanced at her. "You said we're running," she said. "You corrected yourself to I want. I'm noting the first version." He looked at the road. The corner of his mouth moved. He said. 10 days later, the findings arrived. Forsyth sent them by special rider to Silver Creek, which meant the envelope arrived at the ranch in the early morning while Elias was outside, and Clara was at the kitchen table, and the rider knocked and handed it to her directly. She held it for a moment without opening it. Then she opened it. Forsyth's cover letter was 3 sentences Judge Healy has found in favor of Broken River Ranch in full. The foreclosure proceedings are nullified, and the fraudulent alterations to the property record have been referred to the Territorial Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. I'll write in full detail by the week's end, but I wanted you to have the result immediately. She set the letter down. She sat very still for a moment. Then she got up and went to the door. Elias. He looked up from the fence post he'd been setting. She held up the letter. He came across the yard. He took it from her and read it, and she watched his face, the same face she'd been reading for a month, that measured, guarded face, and she watched it do the thing it had done at the Harvest Festival. Go through the composure and out the other side. He read it twice. He handed it back. He said nothing for a moment, and she said nothing, and the morning was bright, and the ranch was quiet, and the east pasture fence was half done, and the ledgers were on the kitchen table, with 3 months of properly organized accounts in Clara's handwriting. It's over, he said. The legal part is over, she said. The building part is just starting. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was a moment, the specific kind of moment that has been building toward itself for weeks and finally arrives unhurried in ordinary daylight, in which something was understood between them that neither of them had to say aloud, because they were both people who said things when they were ready and not before, and both of them apparently were ready. Clara Whitmore, he said. Elias Carter, she said. He stepped forward, and she didn't step back, and what happened next was quiet and real and entirely unhurried, which was exactly right, because nothing about either of them had ever been in a hurry toward anything that wasn't worth arriving at. A month after that, they stood together at the Silver Creek Depot, not waiting for a train, not arriving or departing, just standing on the platform in the early morning because Elias had suggested it, and she'd understood immediately why, and they'd come before the town was awake. The platform was empty. The same boards underfoot, the same iron bench near the depot door, the same view of the main street, quiet and ordinary and real. Clara looked at the spot where she had stood 6 weeks ago with the letter in her hand and the whole town watching. She thought about the woman who had stood there. She did not feel sorry for her. That woman had done what she needed to do. She had not cried. She had picked up her trunk. She had accepted an offer from a stranger who turned out to be something else entirely. That woman had made every decision that led to this platform this morning, this life. She put her hand in her coat pocket. The letter was there. She'd carried it with her for 6 weeks to Helena, and back to every conversation in courtroom and kitchen table. And she took it out now, and she held it in both hands in the early morning air. The arrangement is no longer possible. Do not come to the ranch. She looked at it for one long moment. Then she tore it in half, cleanly. The way she did everything precisely without hesitation, committed to the motion once she'd begun it. She tore it again, and again. She let the pieces fall where they went into the Montana morning, and the wind took some of them, and she watched them go. Elias was standing beside her. Not in front of her, not behind her. Beside her exactly where she'd always needed someone to be, which was the place she'd stopped believing anyone would choose. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. And then, "Better than all right." He nodded. He wasn't looking at the pieces of the letter. He was looking at her. She turned and looked at him. This quiet, steady man who had picked up her trunk on a platform because no one else was moving, who had put coffee on the table without making a performance of it, who had stood in courtrooms and pastures and kitchens and let her lead without once needing to be the one in front. And she understood that this particular combination of things was not something you planned for. You couldn't write it in a letter and send it 2,000 miles. You could only find it when you found it and be smart enough to recognize it when you did. She had been smart enough. That was the thing about Clara Whitmore. When the whole story was laid out, start to finish, platform to platform, rejection letter to morning light. She had always been smart enough. It had just taken the right set of circumstances to give that intelligence a place to stand. She reached out and took his hand. He took hers back. Simple. Real. No ceremony required. The woman who had been rejected at the depot stood on that same platform 6 weeks later with the evidence of her own life in her hands and the whole territory ahead of her. And she was not the woman a man had sent back, And she was not the woman a town had laughed at, and she was not the woman a letter had tried to define. She was Clara Whitmore, who had come 1,900 miles and found something better than what she'd come for. And she had built every inch of it with her own hands, her own mind, and the particular unbreakable quality of a person who picks up her trunk and keeps walking when the world tells her the story is over. The story was not over. The story was exactly where it was always meant to begin.